Yeah,
Hello everyone, and welcome to the first session of Accelerationism and Revolution in Russia. Vladimir Lenin once said, "I'm certainly not radical enough. One can never be radical enough. That is, one must always try to be as radical as reality itself. Reality is indeed circumscribe the very domains of your struggles, whether social or ontological. In other words, our thought and action are always rooted in the structures, and this disposition of the subject to radicate in reality is exactly what defines it as radical. In the history of modern knowledge, the subject disposition to be rooted in reality usually appears in its epistemic forms, not only different versions of determinism. In political history, this disposition usually becomes the matter of resistance and contestation. In this vein, Lenin's saying could be read in the following way. Reality acts upon us faster than it can act upon it. Thus, your task is to accelerate human agents, to enhance your capacity to enroot things and transform reality together with yourselves. Being radical, therefore, is to constantly radicalize oneself. But what does it mean exactly to be radical and to radicalize oneself? What kind of subject does this test presume at specific historical conjunctures? This seminar explores these questions by taking a historical journey across pre-Soviet and Soviet political experiences, focusing on various manifestations of political radicalism, moving away from the domain view of radicalism as mere extreme left or right ideology. This seminar suggests attending to your political selves and focuses on radical subjectivities. In particular, we will trace how forms of Soviet accelerationism, the drive to intensify and harness the force of social and technological transformation, shaped the emergence of new radical subjects and strategies throughout Russian and Soviet history. He studied four distinct radical subjects, each representing specific moments, movements, intellectual projects, or political practices. From late 19th century anarchist populism to post-revolutionary atheist experiments. The seminar sits at the intersection of intellectual history, political philosophy, and cultural history, drawing approaches from each discipline. Each session offers a contextual introduction and a reading of the political text from pamphlets and manifestos to philosophical treatises, allowing us to study both historical and conceptual aspects of radical subjectivities in the formation. The seminar argumentative framework proposed as radicalism, when viewed through the lens of subjectivity formation, implies a fusion of everyday life and political existence, to the point where they become inseparable. In this view, the individual himself becomes a site of political struggle. Radical subjects are neither ideal types nor conceptual characters. They are lived subjects who can guide us through the political imaginaries and um, the political imaginaries and historical landscape of Russian and Soviet radicalism. Marina Simakova is an intellectual historian and writer whose work explores the relationship between ideas and ideologies. Her research sits at the intersection of Marxist thought, cultural history, and political writing. As a writer and editor, she has contributed to a range of journals and media platforms from networks to the Grand Continent. As an educator, she has taught across diverse settings, from traditional college to experimental education initiatives, such as Invisible University of Ukraine, for Ukraine. Marina?
thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was very inspiring, I hope. And I'm just very happy to welcome you to our seminar, Accelerationism and Revolution in Russia. So today in this first session, we'll go over the seminar together. We'll talk about its structure, the organization, the main themes, and also cover the seminar requirements. And then we'll slowly move into the first theme, the actual content of the first episode in the history of political radicalism. As you might have guessed, and as I've already been introduced, I'm Marina. I'm going to be your instructor. I'm a historian of ideas, and I designed this course specifically so that each of you could enrich your own reflection, whether that's artistic, theoretical, or any other kind of research. So you could enrich your own reflection by working with this blend of history and theory. And if you're curious about revolution as an idea, as a historical event, as a revolutionary movement, or as a revolutionary imaginary, I hope you will find this seminar useful and instructive. And I guess I'll stop here with introductions. And in fact, I suggest we leave the personal introductions and all the technical questions for the end of today's session. That way we keep the focus on the material right away, and I think it says a lot for itself and will serve as a warm-up for our exploration of radicalism. And then again, in the very end of the session, when we've already sort of got to know each other through being together and thinking about the subject, we'll, share our names and passions and questions. So again, what is this seminar? What is it about? Generally, this is going to be a short historical exploration of political radicalism. And the 4 sessions I envision, or 4 episodes, as I like to call them, all revolve around this theme, this subject within the context of our revolutionary history. But besides, this historical questioning, historical context, there's also a problem, a question that this seminar raises right from the beginning, the question from which the seminar departs. Let's now pause and think, what do we mean by political radicalism? How do we usually use the word radical? What does the media tell us? How, for example, political writers use this word both in the books or on Twitter, for example? Well, I guess that in everyday conversation, at least, we tend to think of radicalism in 2 ways. On the one hand, it signifies risky political behavior, something outside the norm, something transgressive, even borderline criminal, and at the same time very, very daring. On the other hand, we tend to see radicalism as a characteristic of an ideology, right? An ism, either left or right. Something when an idea pushed to its extreme. But do we really have a clear picture of radicalism as a political phenomenon? Most of the time, I guess it remains just a rhetorical label, a catchy headline, or a pejorative word. So to begin solving this problem, this sort of under-theoretization of radicalism, I suggest we shift the question slightly. And instead of asking what is political radicalism, we can ask, what does it mean to be radical? What does it mean to live a radical life? how does one radicalize oneself? And I think when we ask these questions, we immediately find ourselves on the terrain of personal questions. So to get out of there and to get to philosophical questioning, we need guides, figures who will lead us through the historical material or through the conceptual material, someone who could lead us through the texts, ideas, through events. And each of our 4 sessions will have such a guide, an imaginary guide. I call these guides radical figures. And here our question shifts again. It becomes, who is radical? Here you could also say, borrowing from Deleuze, that each figure who will explore is a conceptual character of sorts, a kind of semi-fictional radical. On the one hand, each of these guides, of these radicals, has a real historical prototype. On the other, in the way we read and use the history of political radicals, they inevitably gain fictional or analytical traits. They become tools for thinking. And with all their radical energy and political agency in the past, they cannot resist their conceptual instrumentalization. It is inevitable. And maybe some of you, especially those who have a background in the social sciences or humanities, here might think of Max Weber and his ideal types, his idea of ideal types, this analytical construction that helps us reason about the social life. And let me say right away here that that's not what we're doing here. Ideal types are made for comparison. These ideal types are theoretical, conceptual constructions, and they can be placed side by side and serve for comparative analysis. Our radicals are singular. Each belongs to a different historical episode and represents a different case of radicalism. They can be juxtaposed, of course, but they cannot really be compared. That's why this Deleuzian idea of conceptual persona, conceptual characters, or guides, as I prefer to call them, fits our task better. Now, what is my approach to the seminar? According to the design, the central point of gravity in this seminar is the argument. By that I mean that we are not going to study a set of facts which we learn. We are not going to build a loose collection of interesting knowledge. What we're doing here is following and developing an argument together. My argument about what it means to be politically radical. And like in any research-based reflection, an argument builds gradually. It doesn't appear fully formed. It usually begins with a question, with a set of questions which are then narrowed down to one question. And with this, it begins with a sense of gap in our understanding, with the feeling that something is missing in the logic or in the historical reasoning. And from there, step by step, it starts to take shape. And this is how this seminar is designed. The argument builds across 4 sessions, growing out that initial sense of a missing link. Here is maybe somebody grasped, I deliberately refer to Charles Darwin and the idea of the missing link in the human evolution. So I think it's a very useful metaphor in respect to knowledge or theoretical reflection. So the framework I'm proposing for this seminar is this. If we look at radicalism not just as an ideology, but through the lens of subjectivity or subject formation, then we begin to see something new. Radicalism appears as a fusion of everyday life and political existence. Here, politics itself gains an existential meaning. At a certain point, the two are no longer separable. And then, in this view, the subject herself becomes the theater of action, the territory of political struggle. And when we talk about radical figures from the past, for example, in this seminar, they are, of course, firsthand, they are conceptual characters, but we can see lived subjects behind them. There were historical people who embodied radicalism in their lives and whose experiences allow us to navigate the political imaginaries. And I think it's very important not to forget that, our theoretical knowledge about politics or our political imaginary, doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It always has a historical reference or referent. Now, the idea that political radicalism emerges out of the fusion of the everyday life, non-political life with politics, and to the extent that politics gains this existential value, this is my argument. It's the perspective I propose, but it's not the only one. You might disagree with my argument. You might critique it. You might want to develop your own version of understanding of political radicalism or radical subjectivity. And that's not only welcome during this seminar, it's necessary. The seminar is not just about receiving an argument, it's about testing it, it's reshaping it, it's exploring together what radicalism might mean. And just as my argument, develops and unravels, yours can too. So the seminar is not only about following my line of thought, it's about you gravitating toward your own argument. Now, the question, how does this happen? How do we gravitate toward an argument? It's quite simple, in design, but can be a little tricky when we deal with it in reality. The argument, again, starts with the question. You ask questions to the materials, to all the readings I propose. By noticing what feels unclear, what seems contradictory, or what sparks your curiosity. Some of you may already have questions just from, reading the course description or by watching a video about the course that circulated in the social media. And that's a good starting point. So after today's session, I ask you to write those questions down, think them over, share them, maybe with the group. And each of you hopefully will have your own entry point. For some, it might be a detail in the text. For others, it's a historical episode or a phrase that, refuses to leave your mind. And if you pursue these questions, you'll begin to form your own argument. Now, how we will work, how each session is organized. As you know, we will meet every Friday, and each session will focus on one theme, one conceptual character, one or a couple of key texts. I expect you and ask you to work in small groups of 2 to 4 people, and I will ask you to prepare short presentations based on the assigned readings, and of course, guided by your own questions. And I will ask you not to think of this as a formal assignment, but rather as a contribution, a way of moving the conversation forward. So each session, so the seminar as a whole again consists of 4 sessions, and each one lasts about 2.5 hours, with the exception of this session, of course. And if we want to attend the organization of each session, then I suggest thinking of it as divided in several blocks. So first, each session we will start with my introduction, sort of historical and intellectual contextual exploration of the subject, and a small lecture on the readings. I will give some comments on the theme, introducing our conceptual character, our radical. Then we'll move to your presentations. I hope it will take about 45 minutes. So it's both my lecture and your presentations, 45 minutes each. So you working in small groups will share your reflections on the material. Then we will move to group discussion, also about 45 minutes. We'll sort of open things up using your questions as the basis for our discussion. And my role will be to help guide and focus the conversation. And then simply like 15 minutes, roughly, we will sum up the key points and maybe suggest guiding questions for the next session. And yeah, so each block obviously, can last a little longer, a little less, may vary a little from session to session. Let's see how things go and how things move. All readings have been already provided by me. You have your reader and you're expected to read this text before the class. I hope you will enjoy reading them and approach them with an open mind and in a critical perspective. I don't know whether you had time to get acquainted, to familiarize yourself, to consult the readings for the first session. If not, nothing stops you from doing it after the session, tonight or tomorrow. And please don't worry if not everything is clear at once. This text I propose to read have their own historical value. They are, products of the space and time. People, authors mention names and events which might seem very distant from us, from our, temporal and spatial landscapes. But things will get clearer as you move throughout the text. And what matters is that you come with questions, reflections, or even doubts. And those are exactly what we need to fuel our discussions. Now, in our last session, we'll take some time to talk through your plans for the final essay. The main thing to remember is that your guiding thread will be the question you've been developing throughout the seminar. The question is what should carry you through the writing, to not get lost in the material. Ideally, it's one question, not a million, not 5 questions. And if at any point you run into difficulties while working on the essay, you are very welcome to reach out. Bring your concerns, even half-formed ideas. We can think them through together. Now, technical things and practicalities, I think it's important to go through them, but again, let's discuss this, how we'll organize presentations, how we'll split into groups in the end of today's session, together with our introductions. And now, with all this in mind, I suggest moving forward and going through the 4 sessions one by one and see what our plan is, what we're going to learn. What I suggest doing now for you is opening probably a syllabus or a blank document and writing down your initial questions. Keep them in mind as we go through each of our 4 sessions. These initial questions will be very, very helpful. Something that brought you here. So the first session is what we will actually begin talking about in a few moments. It's titled An Ascetic or a Terrorist, the People's Will and Populist Voluntarism. The titles of each session reflect the argument. So one part of identity is political, a terrorist, and the other one, an ascetic, is not. And here we will meet our political radical, who is both, whose identity is built on these 2 pillars. And during this first session, we will travel back to the 19th century, and in terms of space, we'll land in the Russian Empire. Very briefly, we will meet one of the most radical underground organizations on the continent, the People's Will, or Народная воля in Russian. And its members, both men and women, coming from very different social backgrounds, from nobles to village teachers, they devoted their lives to the cause of smashing the autocratic regime of the Russian Empire. They were social revolutionaries that had a political task, and they lived for this revolution. And what is striking about them, and this is what you might have already noticed through the readings. What is striking about the popular will and this organization and its members is the importance of conviction, or devotion, the importance of their belief in the cause, the importance of being fully identified with what they were doing. They combined a kind of religious or quasi-religious self-awareness with their politics, with engagement in political struggle. On the one hand, they lived almost ascetic lives, prompting and promoting among their members this ethical code of self-denial. On the other, they built their selves, from this political mission. And they were engaged in very pragmatic tasks. They were busy making bombs, organizing conspiracies, and moving constantly from one apartment to another to evade the secret police. So who were they, ascetics or terrorists? And what I want to argue here is that their radicalism came precisely from this oscillation between the two, from this fusion of martyr-like spirituality with pragmatic political violence. We will explore this in more detail based on readings in a few moments. But philosophically, the popular will, and this historical example, raises questions about the role of voluntarism in politics and conceptual connection between political voluntarism and violence. These themes were, of course, explored previously by many authors, starting from Georges Sorel, for example, to Frantz Fanon. And you can find how other authors try, you can read how the political theorists or militants or, political intellectuals of different kinds asked this question to themselves. What's this connection between voluntarism and violence, voluntarism and terror, and what it means politically? Moreover, I think this touches on another issue, on political fanaticism. This is something Alberto Toscano has written about. And I'm now providing you with these references deliberately. Later on, after the session, you will find them all in the Google Classroom. And but I think it helps, to give you a hint, to give these names, because with some of them you might be familiar, and with some of them not. Sorel, Fanon, Toscano among contemporary theorists, and in the Russophone context and the Russian context, it brings us this whole history of the popular will to the history of radical intelligentsia. This is something which Sergei Bulgakov, the Russian thinker, reflected upon. He had a special piece about the specificity of revolutionary intelligentsia. It's translated into English. It's Heroism and Asceticism, Reflections on the Religious Nature of the Russian Intelligentsia. So he was among the first thinkers, and again, of the early 20th century, who noted this connection or this proximity of religious self-awareness with, political devotion of revolutionary intelligentsia of the late 19th century in the Russian Empire. Again, I will share all these references later, and they'll be available in our Google Classroom. Now, the second session, an intellectual or a militant, professional revolutionaries and Russian social democracy. This session moves us to the very beginning of the 20th century. And at the same time, it will be a direct continuation of the first. We will be still exploring radicalism through the figure of the revolutionary, but the figure changes. Now we will meet the revolutionary who is at once an intellectual and a militant, someone who writes articles and manifestos, but who also goes to factories to organize workers or distribute weapons. Someone who explores questions of philosophical materialism and write short summaries of Marxist theoretical books, and at the same time, again, organizes, goes to the field. This figure really existed within the ranks of Russian social democracy. The party that would soon split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. And this particular fusion of theory and practice and intellectual work, on the one hand, with militant organizing, it was described at the time as the work of a professional revolutionary. So this radical who we will meet is a professional revolutionary. Another way to translate it is revolutionary by trade. This term, actually, it was itself coined by Lenin, and he explained this idea in his famous text, What is to be Done? And this is going to be our key reading for the second session. For those of you interested in the history of revolutions or curious about Marxist theory, this session should be especially rewarding. We will read Lenin with an open mind in a heterodox way, and we will try to ask ourselves, what kind of radical subjectivity does he describe? What kind of radical subject is there in the text? It's not a very popular reading of this text, which was used and abused in the official history of the Bolshevik Party during the Soviet years, and then often served as a sort of introductory reading into the history of the party. But this text has its own, pragmatic value, its own message. And this message, as I argue, is directly related to our questions, about political radicalism and our figure of political radical. And for those of you who want to get deeper, I strongly recommend Lars Lee and his monumental study, Lenin Rediscovered. This study really reconsiders what is to be done in its historical context. It's one of the most rigorous and detailed works done on the subject. Now, session 3. This is a session, a worker or an artist. Again, this oscillation between something that had an immediate political value back then, a worker, representative of the new class, and an artist. Prolet cult and the cultural politics of the post-revolutionary avant-garde. Here, we turn to Soviet Russia after 1917, to the post-revolutionary years, almost a decade. And at the same time, this session, it's also possible to see it as a continuation of the previous one, but it shifts our perspective on radicalism. Now we follow what radicalism means in the sphere of culture and arts. And we look at we are in the 20s, the years of the most radical, uncompromising artistic experiments. Basically, an exploration of political revolution in arts and via artistic means. So here we will focus on a totally different conceptual figure, the worker who is not only making things with his or her hands or with machinery, but who's also writing poems, staging plays, creating ideas. This was the world of the so-called prolet cult, proletarian culture movement, a movement where workers themselves became cultural producers. They didn't just labor in factories, they wrote, they painted, they performed. And, a new culture was supposed to be born, to emerge from this artistic activity. This was gonna become a culture for the new society, culture produced by the new class. And it's quite interesting that this movement, the prolet cult, the engagement of the workers in the artistic production, it developed in a twofold fashion, both from above, because many projects were supported by the so-called Narcomat of Enlightenment, an early Soviet equivalent to Ministry of Culture and Education. And on the other hand, from below, by just, regular workers having this urge for artistic expression and exploration, and, getting some information that now it is possible, just experimenting, putting these words together, painting, or, engaging into artistic production and reflection on what arts mean. This figure of the worker artist, I think, is unprecedented in the history of arts, and it appeared, right after the revolution in the 20s. And for us, it embodies the very idea that art and labor come from the same source, same origin. They have a very similar genesis. And therefore, when it comes to practice, to human practice, which is like a social practice, they must non-problematically fuse into one. And when we, of course, unravel its social or socialistic logic, we understand that this fusion of arts and labor simply signified that culture must no longer belong to elites, but to the people who produce everything in society, who produce bread, who produce machinery. This is the only way to, to build a socialist society with the perspective of this society becoming classless. To overcome this class division by this fusion of the most kind of noble artistic one with the manual work. And I guess that for those of you interested in the Russian avant-garde or in the intersection of politics and culture, this third session may be especially engaging, interesting. Together, we will read some prolet cult poems in translation, and we will ask what kind of radical subjectivity emerges when artistic experiment and industrial production merge into one. Now, the final session, session 4. Here we will move in history toward the post-war years and the Soviet Union in the end of 40s. And the session is titled A Hero or a Sacrifice. Again, this duality, this oscillation between the two, radical cosmologies and the science of immortality. This is going to be our last session, the concluding one. and it will bring our seminar to its culmination. And at first glance, the topic, cosmology, cosmist philosophy, cosmological thinking, this doesn't seem, to reflect our subject in any possible way, right? It's very far from politics as we usually understand it. It doesn't deal with political parties, with organizations, or with preparation for revolution. But if we look closer, we see something deeper. And what is at stake here is the long-term effect of the October Revolution. It's sort of acceleratory echo. Its effect not only on society in general, not only on society in terms of its social composition, but on the very constitution of the self, of the Soviet subject, or on, this text which we will be reading and discussing together deals specifically with this question, what it means to be a materialist and a Soviet materialist. And here our question becomes the following: what kind of subject appears once the revolution has already happened, when it's in the past? And further, how can one remain radical in the aftermath of the revolution, when again the revolution is in the past? Is it even possible? Is it necessary? And if so, on what grounds? This is what we're going to be talking about during the fourth session. And to think through this, we turn to Evald Ilyenkov, to his famous philosophical treaty, Cosmology of the Spirit. It's going to be the most philosophical text of our seminar. And again, on the surface, it might look abstract, speculative, almost detached from politics, but again, inside its philosophical reflection lies quite a radical political project, I would argue. And for our final discussion, we will let Ilyenkov guide us, with his very striking vision of Soviet and materialist subjectivity, the materialist who embraces collective self-sacrifice for the sake of, salvation of matter, salvation of the universe. And here we will ask how radicalism might persist not only after the revolution, not only when it's in the past, but also beyond the revolution, in a space where politics, philosophy, and cosmology converge. And for those of you who are curious about contemporary philosophy, new materialism, or, for example, Spinozism, any related debates, this may be the most rewarding, exciting, and challenging session. And personally, this text is one of my favorite texts, the text I like to teach and to analyze together with students. And to help you deepen your reading, your philosophical interest, I also here point to some secondary sources, a commentary by Alexei Penzin in Iflex, and also Slavoj Žižek reflected on Ilyenkov's cosmology in his commentary. Again, Google Classroom, I will provide all the references there, you will find them, don't worry. Now, we're done with with our plan, our 4 sessions, and now I'd like to summarize what we're going to be doing here. We'll begin in the 19th century with the passion and devotion of the popular will or people's will, these organizations. We will meet this radical storm between asceticism and terrorism, we move into the early 20th century, where revolution itself becomes a profession. Then we step into the post-revolutionary years, where a kind of radicalism, it takes on a cultural form, and the worker becomes an artist. So society is sort of shaped through this creative work. And finally, we end our session on the most philosophical note with Ilyenkov's cosmology, asking whether radicalism can endure after revolution and even beyond politics. So, the movement of the seminar, as I describe it, is not only historical, as you see. It develops together with the argument I propose, that radical subjectivity, it emerges where life and politics fuse so tightly that they can no longer be separated. And in each of our sessions, this fusion appears in a different form, not only in a different light, but in a different form. That's why I told that these four radicals are incomparable. They are singular. First, we deal with politics as a spiritual and moral matter. It's the ultimate answer to existential questions about the human duty, about what a human is, what it is to act, and for what cause. Then, it's the second session. We will look at politics, radical politics, becoming a profession, a demanding craft that combines intellectual work at the desk with organizational tasks. Next, we will see radical politics as engagement in creation, the making of things, whether material, artistic, or cultural. And finally, we will see politics in its most expansive sense, beyond what we normally understand by it, and definitely beyond what political scientists understand of it. A cosmological politics, right? Where the very material existence of the universe becomes the horizon of political struggle. Now, let's finally turn to our first session. The one that's going to be maybe the shortest in terms of our, engagement with the material. But this is intentionally so. It is meant to warm up our reflection on political radicalism. And I hope it will, open up the space, serve as a door to the space of discussion, both the darkest and the brightest pages in the history of political radicalism. Now, the people's will and political voluntarism. What is it? Let's first, let's explore some context. We are in the 19th century. And in the second half of the 19th century, when the People's Will as organization was established, the whole European continent was haunted by a wave of movements. These were national emancipatory movements. And historians often call this period the Spring of Nations. So what we can see there, that back then, across Central and Eastern Europe, people who had long lived under empires, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, or the Romanov Empire, the Russian Empire, they began to fight for independence, for language, for culture, for self-determination. It was a time of revolutions and uprisings, popular uprisings, and also it was a time of manifestos, of, sort of democratization of political writing. And of course, this was the time when the new political imaginaries were born and thrived. What united these national emancipatory movements was the demand for popular politics from below, right? So this was the idea that ordinary people, not dynasties, not imperial elites, not nobles, it's the people who should become the foundation of political life. And very often this democratic demand, fused with the project of the nation in a political sense. Again, nation not in an ethnic sense, but in a political sense. Something that we often call the state sometimes. Political nation. To be free for people, engaged in these emancipatory movements meant, not only to claim their rights, it's it's also something more kind of daring. It's creating a state of their own, a nation state in which the people could rule themselves outside the empire without this imperial, weight and project. And in Russia, if we, go to Russia, Russia was not a nation struggling for emancipation. It was itself a vast empire with various ethnic groups suppressed and a mass of peasants newly released from the chains of serfdom. And despite the emancipation, these peasants, they still carried out the memory of their unfreedom. They carried it out in their bodies, in their lifestyles, in the organization of their work. So anyway, at this background, Russia had its own version of the emancipatory movement, which was called Narodniki, or the populists. The populists, coming from the word people or folk. So Narodniki, or the populists, they looked to the peasants. They were very enthusiastic about the village commune with its traditions of collective life. It was sort of primordial collectivity, pre-socialist. Again, the populists were very enthusiastic about the peasant communes as a form of living, form of collective life. And they, on the one hand, they went to the village, so they went to the villages and they spoke to peasants. On the one hand, they went there for inspiration, and on the other, they went there to agitate, to mobilize the peasants for the uprising, for the popular uprising. Roughly by the 70s, by the 1870s, the populists, they, already spent years with this going to the people, as they called it, with this agitation among peasants. But the problem was that villagers were often suspicious to them because the populists were mainly representatives of the poor intelligentsia. So people like teachers, for example, and villagers were suspicious about them. And the efforts of this radical intelligentsia of the populace, often were futile. They failed. They were arrested, followed by the Tsar's police, and the general peasant uprising never came. So this failure of the populist, it was, generally important to rethink political strategy and revolutionary strategy. It convinced part of the populist movement that propaganda among the peasants, propaganda alone, was fruitless. And when there is an empire, and in this empire, there's also like a centralized political apparatus and repressive state, it's very difficult, to get this social revolution happening by meaning of propaganda alone. And the time was for a different kind of action. This is how People's Will as organization emerged, established itself. What united its members with the populists was their social sensitivity. Of course, People's Will was a radical political organization. They operated in clandestine, they turned their life into, working for one political cause. It's both social and political revolution, but they have a very acute sense of social injustice. Both the members of the popular will and all populists. Populists were more on the side of social utopianism, and the people who lived and who sort of led the socialist utopia were peasants, while the People's Will and the members of the People's Will had a different project. They were all about engaging in a direct action, and direct action means not going to the village and trying to convince the villagers to organize a popular uprising against autocracy. For the members of the People's Will, direct action meant organizing a terror act against autocracy, meaning against nobility, or literally against the Tsar. So where the populist and the People's Will diverge was their political strategy. For the latter, it became ultimately political. But again, what united them was the social sensitivity. And what I wanted to say is that this label of being a social justice warrior is really applicable to both the populists and the members of the People's Will. Generally, it's very, it would be fair to say that this acute social sensitivity characterizes a Russian radical intelligence in general. Now, the People's Will. So what was their project about? Well, since both the populists and the People's Will, they wanted to foster a social revolution to change the dominant order, the social order, but the People's Will basically wanted to seize the state apparatus and to destroy the whole system, the whole political system, which was in the basis of the Russian Empire. And this transition from, very kind of social education centered project toward the political task, killing the Tsar, seizing the power, this transition, I would argue, fostered a move from, a quasi-religious morality, which populists shared, something about being good to people, being just to everyone, being equal. So there was a transition from this toward a life mission which required devotion of a higher degree. This devotion of a higher degree meant, full as a complete association with the organization and its task. And its task was to destruct autocracy through political terror. Only this could open the path to social change, according to the members of the popular will. Only this could serve as a radical example of change. And in the readings, you might have seen the program, the excerpt of the program, and see for yourself what was radical about them as an organization. It's not only their methods, but their explicit political aims. They were unprecedented in Russia at the time. So first, they wanted to overthrow the monarchy and establish what they called people's constitution. There was no constitution back then in Russia, no constitution. And then they wanted to pursue a project of popular constitution. Then they wanted the members of the popular will, a constituent assembly, elected by universal suffrage. There was no universal suffrage in Russia. There was no universal suffrage in many countries back then. So it was a radical demand of sorts. Then they wanted civil liberties, something which was strongly associated with the French Revolution back then. It's freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of speech. And finally, they insisted on the necessity for the land distribution to peasants. Again, unlike earlier populists, the people's will, they openly prioritized not only social but political revolution, which was, of course, conceived in such a way that it should foster, radical social reform. So political revolution should precede social revolution according to the radical program of the people's will. And what the organization targeted was basically the head of the system, the head of the empire, the Tsar himself. For them, it was the key of, dismantling autocracy. It was both the symbol and its main structural element. And the people's will, they sort of pioneered the systematic use of political terror in Russian Empire. And they created a well-organized clandestine network devoted to the planning of this acts of political terror. And of course, as I've already said, their hallmark was the assassination against Alexander II, the Tsar. They literally tried to kill him multiple times. So for example, in 1879, there was an attempt to bomb the railway line. This attempt failed. And very soon, in 1880, there was a bomb under the Winter Palace, the Tsar's residence. It killed the guards, but it missed the Tsar. And finally, a year later, there was a successful attempt. So the members of the People's Will, they bombed the Tsar's carriage in St. Petersburg. And this explosion killed Alexander II. And this political assassination was sort of the climax of their political radicalism. It was a very, it was a very shocking event, because for the first time in modern Europe and beyond, a reigning monarch was killed by revolutionary organization, not by aristocratic conspirators, not by his family members who want to seize the throne, by a revolutionary organization. And not in the course of revolution, just in the plain daylight. This association was really kind of formative event for not only for the kind of identity of political radicalism back then, but also, of course, for the political life in the country, because the wave of political repressions was very heavy, and the censorship and so on. Was mass arrests, executions, including the key members of the People's Will. And as a result, the network of the People's Will was destroyed. And later on, when Russian social democracy emerged, we will talk about this next week and during the next session, the members of the social democracy, they in many ways reflected on the failures of the People's Will. So if People's Will reflected on the failures of the populists, Russian social democracy, which will later, split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, they reflected on the failures of the People's Will. And here we can already have this bridge to the next session. But there is another bridge to the very final session on cosmology. Interestingly enough, among the members of the People's Will was one person, his surname was Kibalchich, so one person who was put in prison after the assassination of the Tsar, and when in prison, and he was sentenced to death, and when he was, expecting, his sort of during the last night in jail, he was sketching the model of a space apparatus, something like a prototype for a spaceship. Why? How did it happen? In fact, this person, the member of the People's Will, he was responsible for explosions. And you probably have a certain idea of how, reactive engine is working. It requires this kind of explosion-like force. So this engagement, the very pragmatic task of constructing, the bomb from scratch, enabled the member of the people's will, the Skibalchich, to come up with the idea of the first spaceship. And the project is, of course, very sketchy, very simple, but the principle is, in a way, close to the principle which will be used later when a real, space, first, space rockets will be designed. I think this is a very interesting fact, how different bits of knowledge and experience, can strengthen each other or fuse. Now let's return to our question of political radicalism. And here, I think we can move from the people's will as an organization. We can move, but not move forward, or move a decade earlier, and look at a figure who never actually belonged to the people's will, but who in many ways embodied the very ethics they later lived by. He was a real historical person, but at the same time, he can also be seen as a kind of conceptual character in his own right, Sergei Nechayev, a revolutionary figure of the late 19th century, active in the late 19th century Russian Empire. Again, I move a decade earlier from the people's will. I look as its source, it's, not as its source, but something that precedes it. And actually, I often use this technique, this as a method of understanding something, using like a reverse chronological order. So what was before? Not necessarily, what made a direct impact or, an influence, not necessarily on the source of inspiration for the subject or the movement or the author in question. But just, a decade earlier, what was there about political life? So before the people's will, the organization, they were populists. But even before, there was Sergei Nechayev. And Nechayev, he was one of the most extreme and uncompromising figures of the Russian revolutionary underground in the 19th century. He was born in 1847. He was the son of a poor worker, and he entered radical circles as a young man. He became known for his strong personality and sort of absolute commitment to revolutionary cause. But another note, it was generally, like that people entered radical movements, revolutionary movements, when they were very, very young in the 19th century. They could be 16, 17, 18. What's curious about that when we now have a leap forward to the 60s, for example, and to the movement which we usually call the May 68, the sort of youth movement, these young people who were on the left, who were against different forms of political conservatism and, remnants of the past, which were there in many institutions, even of the pre-war past, and which sort of was the obstacle for the society to move forward. We have this youth as a political subject in the 60s and the 70s. And in the 19th century, it was not like that. So there was no youth as a political subject. These people were young, they entered the movement, they became radicals, they became revolutionaries, and then the age didn't matter anymore. I think this says something about how our society and how our understanding of politics, engagement into political subject changes with time. Nobody in the 19th century treated these young members of the revolutionary movement, be they populists or the members of the popular will or Nechayev himself. Nobody treated them as youth or young people, even though they were. Now, Nechayev, so he also entered these radical circles when he was very, very young. And again, he was not a member of the People's Will, of Народная воля. He belonged to a different organization, which he formed. His organization called People's Retribution, or Народная расправа. Retribution is a very heavy word in Russian. It's it has this it immediately conveys this its connection to violence or to revenge, to redemption. This organization, People's Retribution, it differed from the People's Will. It was People's Will was a network, organized, operating clandestine, but a network. And People's Retribution was quite a small secret circle of students and workers. They were active in very late 60s, early 70s. And later on, both populists and members of the People's Will, they were quite skeptical about People's Retribution and about Sergei Nechayev in particular. They found, his methods, too much. They found his organizational model too ruthless, and albeit they also followed this model of self-sacrifice in a way. The rhetoric of sacrifice in Nechayev's piece writing, and was too heavy for both the populists and the People's Will. And at the same time, although they sort of distanced themselves from Nechayev, this rhetoric of sacrifice, it remained in the actions of many representatives of the Russian radical revolutionary intelligentsia, and generally in the underground revolutionary tradition in the Russian Empire. It was there up until 1917, and even after, when there was an attempt to assassinate Lenin, this woman who, attempted his assassination and who was allegedly half blind, she belonged to another radical organization, Socialist Revolutionaries, and she directly sort of inherited this ethos, this underground revolutionary tradition because when she attempted to assassinate Lenin, she knew very well that she would be captured and sent to prison, and that this this act should serve as an example of and as an expression, ultimate expression and last expression of her political will and political will of those who do not agree with politics of the party. So now, getting back to Nechayev, to Sergei Nechayev, what made him well known was a piece of writing that we can call a kind of manifesto, Catechism of the Revolutionary, or in another translation that I prefer to use, it's the Catechism of the Revolutionist. And you will find this document in the readings, or you might have already found it. It's paired with Mikhail Bakunin's Revolutionary Catechism. Bakunin's catechism, in fact, was written 3 years earlier than Nechayev. Again, we make this move, back, not forward. And Bakunin's catechism is sometimes suspected by historians of being a source for Nechayev. Here, we will not discuss these historical debates, because what I find more interesting and useful for our task, for you to compare these two documents yourself and see how these two catechisms speak to one another. What do they have in common? Where do they diverge? Generally, by the way, Nechaev's Catechism of the Revolutionary, it never became a mainstream program, but it served as a sort of code for the organization, and more importantly, it gave expression to radical tendency. By radical tendency, I mean something broader, the tendency that haunted Russian, society at that moment, and Russian political thought, this idea that revolution requires devotion. And in Nechayev, for Nechayev, revolution requires complete annihilation of the individual self and complete, oblivion of ordinary morality. Now, I'd like us to do a bit of a close reading, which is very easy when it comes to such manifestos, such texts as Nechaev's, because it's written in such a form that's very easy to follow. It's like commandments. So let's focus here on several statements, on several commandments, if you like, of Nechaev's text. Let's start with the first one. If you like, you can open it. I'm really happy I was able to share this particular version, this particular publication by Kropotkin Lighthouse. I think it's really beautiful. It's a piece of art in itself, and you can see that the text was once published, once printed, after typed with a typewriter. I think it's really, really, really beautiful. So the first point, right, as you can see here, the revolutionist is a doomed man. He has no personal interests, no affairs, sentiments, attachments, property, not even a name of his own. Everything in him is absorbed by one exclusive passion, the revolution. What we can see here is that this very sentence institutes sort of an existential renunciation as the foundational condition of the political subject. It, determines and prescribes the basis of what it is to be a revolutionary, of her identity, renunciation of name, property, attachments, functions like a religious vow. Poverty, chastity, anonymity. And here we can see that identity, if we understand identity in a contemporary way, is evacuated, and it's reconstituted solely as devotion to an object, revolution. Moreover, we can see here this language of doom, how it reframes political commitment as as a sacramental fate rather than a personal choice. But here is the trick. It actually becomes a sacramental fate by choice. It doesn't precede it. And when, you choose something as your fate, it's not renunciation of agency, it's the result of the agency being exercised. But here we still see that sort of spiritual consecration replaces personal biography. And the revolutionary belongs to the cause, and his or her belonging becomes this foundation of his or her radical self, or the self which both dissolves in his mission and becomes this mission, right? So here we can see this dialectical sort of movement between these two poles. On the one hand, the revolutionary gets rid of everything, of all the ties in this world. But on the other, he or she becomes the world, or at least becomes politics through his or her mission. Now let's probably move to another fragment, number 5, for example. The revolutionist is a doomed man. Here you can see this very poetic repetition. It also reminds us about epics, about religious texts, right? The revolutionist must be ready to die at any moment. He must train himself to endure torture. What we see here is basically a programmatic orientation toward martyrdom, right? And read existentially, it demands certain, that suffering becomes a habit and a discipline. At least you're ready for it. And one can even go as far as claiming that here death and torment become techniques of spiritual formation. The imperative to train, converts martyrdom from accidental fate into sort of practiced asceticism. At least you have to be always ready for it, and this readiness to die or to be, tortured for the sake of revolution is a spiritual exercise in itself. So the revolutionary soul, if you like, is forged by exposure to this task, which is risky and life-threatening. And this absolute openness to suffering for the cause of revolution, can be seen again as something spiritual, right? And here we immediately read number 7. All tender, softening sentiments of kinship, friendship, love, gratitude, and even honor itself must be snuffed out in him, in the revolutionary, by the one called passion of the revolutionary cause. So what Nietzsche prescribes here is basically affective austerity, right? Ordinary moral attachments or sentiments are out of the question, that are not merely optional. They are seen as obstacles to vocation. And this, it's interesting that when he speaks about passion or the revolutionary cause, he calls it cold passion, a passion that is, and the very word passion comes from suffering, passions of Christ. The passion, when it comes to suffering, the passion is never cold, right? It's something which is related to intensity of experience, intense feelings, intense, sensual experience. And here Nietzsche simply calls it, this passion for the revolutionary cause, cold. Well, you can ask yourself, why is that? But one of the explanation would actually come not from Nietzsche, but from the general climate of the late 19th century, and it's with its especially in the continent, with its kind of hunger for scientific explanation to everything. So albeit this revolution, our readiness, engagement into the revolutionary work becomes a spiritual exercise of sorts. There's also this nihilist, cold, and kind of semi-scientific vision of revolution as the only possible, course of the events. And here, this idea of necessity, of fate, which revolutionary chooses, appears again. But generally, this document, I think it leaves a lot of wordings, a lot of material to speculate about this religious language, how, for example, salvation is reframed. Instead of this moral warmth and, unity and universal brotherhood, we have this ascetic, cold heat, if I may say so, cold heat of revolutionary zeal. Now, I guess I'd like to attend to the last fragment, which is slightly different, but I think it's very, very important in the context of, you know, our, in the political context in general, to contextualize this document. So number 23, Nietzsche writes, by revolution, we do not understand a regulated movement after the classical Western model, a movement which always bow into the property rights and the traditions of the social systems. Only that revolution will be beneficial to the people, which will destroy at the very root every vestige of statehood and will annihilate all of state traditions, institutions, and classes. So here you can see that Nietzsche basically opposes to the idea that the social revolution could be carried through the reform or without the total annihilation of the social and political order gradually, or that some institution could survive the revolution. No, he says no categorically, right? He says no tradition should survive, no element of the already existing social system. The revolution should destroy at the very root every element of statehood, etc. And I guess this fragment is rather clear in terms of its connotations to salvation, right? Only out of complete annihilation of the old order and its old structures, we can see a new and just social life being born. But what you can also spot in this fragment is this at the very root, this construction at the very root, which etymologically connects it to the word radical. And now I simply invite you to closely examine the document, the catechism, in your free time. If you haven't done it yet, it's a very short and singular document. And you will see by yourself that in fact it is a sort of chillingly systematic program for revolutionary life, despite its zeal. And being radical, if we deduce it from Nietzsche's catechism, means simply becoming a person who has cut, who is ready to cut all ties to society, to family, with law, morality, all ties to existing structures, and even, you know, having no personal interest except political revolution. Right. And yeah, that's why you will see, right, that the catechism reads more like a manual of ascetic discipline, a manual of ruthless conspiracy, and its style, the way it is written, how stark it is, how uncompromising it is, almost religious in its absolutism, right? It was a part of its shocking effect. I'm sure it might have this shocking effect now as well. But if we go to our question about radicalism, I'm sure that Nietzsche's catechism rather prompts questions on the nature of political radicalism than provides very coherent answer. But at the same time, it's a perfect example of political radicalism through the lens of subjectivity. This is why I really wanted us to start examining, you know, radical subjectivity with this text. However, one note should be made here. with all these connotations to religion, to popular religiosity, especially to Christianity. You know, this quasi-religious language was not uncommon back then, especially in the rhetoric of national emancipatory movements. Those movements which spread across the continents in the late 19th century, and to which Nechayev and the people's will oppose in a way, but share the task of the social revolution. These movements also relied on religious language because it was the language of popular politics back then. It was easy to grasp. If people who joined the emancipatory movements had any bits of education, this was, you know, the church school. And if they didn't, most likely the language they were most familiar with was the language of catechism. This language, for example, was used by Giuseppe Mazzini in Italy. Mazzini was a prominent figure of Italian emancipatory movement for popular nationalism. And he explicitly spoke of the nation in terms of, you know, divine mission and moral duty. And he had this very famous quote, falsehoods or corruptions pass away as tyrannies pass. God remains, as does the people, the image of God on earth. Il popolo è immagine di Dio sulla terra. So you see how heavy this, you know, this language in the sentence is. Not only it uses religious language, it's, you know, plays with this connection to, you know, with politics, people, God on earth, etc. But even in the case of Mazzini and with this heavy religious language, this functioned as inspiration. Unlike Nechayev, he never developed this literal life program of ascetic devotion. Nechayev's catechism, by contrast, you know, here you deal not only with rhetoric or with conceptual constructions, you have a concrete rule of existence. And for those of you interested in the very fashionable subject of political theology, I encourage you to explore the debate between Mazzini and Bakunin. Bakunin, whose catechism we also have among the readings. The debate on this topic, on political theology. This is basically exactly, this debate is exactly where the very expression political theology comes from. And of course, you are invited to explore Bakunin's catechism in the readings. And getting back to Nechayev, I hope this very brief exploration of radical subjectivity through his catechism was stimulating and left you with some food for thought. What we've seen here, Angus, is not just political strategy, but a vision of life itself. And this vision turned into a program of devotion and sacrifice. I find it to be an early and very extreme example of how politics and existence can fuse until they become inseparable. And as we will be moving forward in the seminar, I invite you to keep this question in mind. What does it mean to live politically when politics claims the whole of life? So now I think we can move to the concluding part of our session. Thank you all very much for your attention, for listening carefully and attentively to my exploration of, voluntary, political voluntarism and radicalism of the late 19th century. Now, let's move to questions, introductions. Let's discuss how we will come along our presentations. We can finally get to know each other a little, right? And I'd really like you, I'd really like to kindly ask you to say just a couple of words about yourself. I'm really curious to hear your name and what your passions are, and also what brought you here, what made you interested in the subject of political radicalism. Because maybe I can be helpful to you providing like additional literature or maybe even adjust our discussion according to the interests you already have. And let me start. I'm Marina, as you know, and I've always been fascinated by two things. How words gain their political meaning and how ideas become ideologies. And sometimes back again, sometimes actually ideologies kind of turn into ideas. So during these sessions, I hope to share my intellectual preoccupation with you guys. And I'm now really curious to meet you and to know a little about you.
Yeah, maybe I'll start. I had the camera on for most of the class. So I'm Yura. I'm actually art and curatorial practice certificate student here. But what attracted me to this class wasn't radicalism. I'm Lithuanian. So what attracted me most was both I feel like this is a class in which I maybe can understand better my own history, like my family's history, part of the Soviet Union, and even the current geopolitical situation, because it's very intense. It's intense in terms the way that we view Russians, both in Russia and in Lithuania, like Lithuanian Russians, and it has both become an issue and become like a very mobilizing force within Lithuania. But even now, like when you were, I didn't have time to read the reading, but looking at the points and you talking, like even that the zeal of revolutionary life, like to me explains a bit these huge these huge what I can like I don't know if maybe they could be called genocidal acts, but at the start of the Soviet Union, when it came to Ukraine, when it came to Eastern Europe, Siberia, Holodomor and stuff, it feels like, there's not only like this is a nation that wants to kind of be imperial and remove a lot of people that are against that, but also there's this, there's the zeal, there's this it feels very yeah, there's a faith there. There's more than just, a political goals is also like a salvation thing. So this is why I'm in this class to better understand my state, my history, and then this current situation that I live in.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this, and I would be really happy to bring more, problematization of what's happening now, and of course, when I designed this course, I couldn't, help thinking about what's going on in the world, about the war, about the military aggression, about the imperial projects, or about the whole heritage and baggage of the Russian imperialism. And there are many small things that even, for example, the revolutionary history or the Soviet official history sort of not denied, but wasn't particularly attentive to, in my opinion, that if we deal with the revolutionary heritage, for example, the people who belong to the social democracy, they were most active in the territory of contemporary Ukraine or Georgia. It not necessarily came in the center. The revolutionary cells were very active there. So throughout the vast empire, the revolutionary project united people against autocracy and imperial powers as one enemy. And again, when we speak about the Bolshevik and the Menshevik, fractions of the Social Democratic Party, you look at the geography and you see where it was, active. And yeah, again, and another story about the Polish revolutionary social revolution and their intense contact and how they helped each other because empire was their common enemy. And I think that this is something we tend to forget nowadays, engaging in this, political debate, which renders politics to geopolitics and interests of the countries. I hope we will talk about this more, especially when we go, closer to the Soviet history.
Yeah, what I wanted to add, I did my bachelor's thesis was on interwar Lithuania. It was more in Jewish representation, but I didn't read that much of radical politics or about communism. But I even through what I've read, there were like two distinct camps. Like there were people who were that were radicals and that were not necessarily connected to any state or any organization, and then there were communities that were connected to Russia. So even though like the goal was more or less like very socialist, but even that connection and how they approached it's different. So I think, yeah, that's a good point to keep that in mind, that not even though like maybe the goal, or not the goal, but maybe like goals are the same, the way that they are approached, and like the end result, the imagined end result is different. So thank you.
I guess I'll go next. Can you hear me? My name is Gosha. I would say I have a lot of similar motivations, maybe as Yura, like not so much specifically the revolutionary aspects of the course, but more so just the overall like sort of historical context and like this region of the world is something that I find interesting and I want to learn more about. This class is a little bit out of left field for me. I didn't study anything similar to this, like regarding like philosophy or politics. I studied architecture, so I'm not used to taking classes that are like more philosophical and sort of like focused on these like political movements, but it's something that maybe I've noticed is like not yeah, like something I would like to maybe gain more exposure and understanding of. Also because of my own roots being like in Eastern Europe, I'm Polish. And I mean, so far all of this is going to be new to me essentially. But I'm looking forward to learning more about all of this and seeing how I might find like parallels in any of this information to like things that I've already done in my own work or things that I can relate to just personally. And also interested in like the current political situation and how that might connect.
Thank you so much, Gosha. I actually wanted to say that if you feel like bringing your background or your interest, like architecture, for example, to you see how to integrate this into the presentation or in the essay. I really encourage you to do so, because I mean, architecture is politics.
I mean, the image
Right?
you used for the course is a very compelling image of a building. I forget exactly what it was, like a sanatorium.
The sanitarium, yes.
Why did you choose that image?
Well, speaking frankly, it was not my choice.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it's the organizers, but I just had no objections. I would maybe go with some other buildings like constructivism and social housing, something which associate with the social. Well, sanatoriums, of course, they were part of the social revolution because they were designed in such a way that the laborers, the workers, could have their leisure, their resorts and the houses for their leisure. So the architecture reflected, their social significance and the new understanding of leisure with sports, relaxation, and sort of a simple, popular resort with different kinds of leisure. This building, of course, was supposed to somehow accommodate for all these types of leisure, etc. And yes, I'm very curious about what we can move in very different directions of talking about what is radical architecture, for example.
Yeah, there's plenty of examples of that, I guess, but I don't know how they compare to radical politics. I guess I'll see how that all, I don't know, once we get into it. Yeah, and I'm probably going to be more interested in like the last two classes based on what you said about like the art versus manual labor and the last class, which seems like a little bit more philosophical, but still focused on like there's like a lot of aesthetics there that
True.
that
Yes.
maybe can tie to like, I don't know, radical designs for things that I've looked at also. I don't know. I've seen some things related to Cosmosome that are very like visual and
Right.
technical.
Right. Mm. And but if I may, there are actually several directions in which we can go here. For example, I once read a book which looked at the not the assemblies, but at the Socialist International. They got together. They had the congresses, something, you know, which might seem very boring from its description. Okay, this people met, they wrote resolutions, they fought again, they argued, but the book looked at these congresses as performances. It's a great work, and it really enriches our understanding of the socialist politics of the time. And getting back to your point, I think what I'm trying to do here with your help as well is to approach radical subjectivity and radicalization of subjectivity. So, for example, the post-revolutionary experiments in architecture, which were supposed to create the new kind of everyday life, the ways in which apartments were constructed was supposed to have such an impact on, you know, on people's bodies, right? On how people feel, how they behave in space. It was, we can call it a radicalization of subjectivity. This is just an idea.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks. Looking forward to the rest of this.
Anyone else? Anyone wants to have a say and to introduce yourself? Oh, thank you, Pradeep, for sharing. Yes, for sharing the.
Yeah. Hi, I think this would be a good segue for my introduction. I come from a design background, so sort of similar roots with architecture in that sense, but at least from like a very Bohosian standpoint. And of course, that was sort of a revolutionary movement in terms of how art was sort of I remember Marshall Duchamp, if I'm not wrong, who once wrote that the purpose of design was to bring down art from the pedestal that it stands from and make it for everyday usage or common usage. So that was the purpose of design per se, at least at least in that era, which is closer to somewhere around, I don't know, 1940s maybe. But of course, the way design has evolved as a field overall, I find myself sort of being stuck in uh, how design is sort of used to, in at least fields such as advertising and marketing and so on and so forth, and products are meant to be sold in that sense, and design cannot exist without the capitalist engine per se. And it is the whole economy that fuels the production of design and production of objects at all levels, more or less. Unless you're looking at design from a very social standpoint, which just makes it more systems thinking and not anything to do with aesthetics or objects per se. And in that sense, design becomes very broad as planning or as organizing and so on and so forth. So it could very well be management at that standpoint, does not remain design, let's say, very explicitly. And so that becomes another conundrum for me, let's say, who has a background in design. Yeah, I think I struggle and with my own background and position in the world, and my background's position in the world, and the idea of let's say, if I I'm not too long already, I think the idea of revolutionary has sort of been, or not revolutionary, or just being radical to an extent, has been um, uh, some sort has been necessary in terms of um, any form of creation, I would say. Uh, a form of intensity that does not have space explicitly, that needs to be created from something else. I think that pushing of limits is sort of embedded in any creative act whatsoever, and so it always aims to radicalize itself more and more, and this is at least what we see in design history or aesthetic history. That is something that becomes more and more evident. um, so yeah, that's part of me, who I am, my background, I think, all intertwined together. I don't have a structure or a perfect question that I would like to, or let's say a way to describe myself apart from this. I think this is the most honest I can be for now.
Thank you so much, Pradeep. I'm yeah, it's great. Like, to what extent, like, any creative work is radical in a way, right? But like, it's a requirement, almost like an ontological prerequisite for the creative work to be made. And at the same time, we sometimes, I guess, we deal with this demand to be creative in everything we do is annoying. It's almost a marketing tool, like be creative or remain creative and efficient at the same time, and be efficient with your creativity. And sometimes you start questioning, like, yourself, what is this creativity about? Is this different creativity that sort of the capitalist structure in which our work is embedded nowadays and for centuries expect from us, or how our idea of creativity changes with the transformation of economic and social structures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of interesting questions to explore, and to look at radicalism as a form of to look as radicalism as a form of creativity, or to explore at least this conceptual connection between pushing the limits or even transgressing them and creative work. I'd be very, very curious to see how this reflection develops, during our course, and maybe during the presentations and then your final work. I think it's really great.
Yeah, I think is this also a space for questions or just for introductions? Because I may not necessarily have a question per se, but I would like to sort of add a node into what you are saying, what you said earlier in your lecture. Could I do that as of now, or should we move to questions later?
Well, if you already started, I think go on. I think we can do it in a more natural way now. Yes, why not?
Okay, yeah. So I think when you touched upon a form of asceticism being required for, let's say, a revolutionary or being radical politically, it reminded me of a recent, so not a recent, but it came to my recent knowledge that one of an Indian thinkers wrote about a book on Buddha or Marx. Oh, sorry, it was Marx or Buddha. So the idea was to do a comparative analysis in terms of what provides a better alternative. It was written by B.R. Ambedkar. who was a socialist. He was also popularly known as father of Indian Constitution. And so, yeah, he was a socialist, but in one of an interviews of his, I also saw him referring to himself as a communist, and advocating for communism as a form of societal structure. What that book basically aimed to argue, in some sense, that this spiritual gap that Marxism has could be filled by Buddhism in a certain sense. But that is not what I want to bring to the table. Of course, whether the spiritual gap exists or not could be another question altogether. But I think there is certain similarity in terms of what, let's say, a person like Buddha, who is more, let's say, radically philosophical or spiritual in that sense, and Marx, who has radicalized a certain kind of political philosophy, share in common, and that speculation uh, met at a place where those two ideas were converging, at least let's say in the Southeast Asia, India specifically. And then there's another figure called Genden, who was a Mongolian king who has anecdotally been said to have slapped Stalin after a point when Stalin questioned, let's say, the legitimacy of Buddha. And he said there are only two great men who have been born. One is Marx, one is Buddha. And so perhaps, those are like interesting anecdotes that I would like to add in the discussion. Something that we could all reflect upon, I guess.
Thank you, Pradeep. We actually have this Discord channel. I think this is the perfect place for the interesting anecdotes and in stories. And please share the title of that book here in the chat or in the Google Classroom or elsewhere.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Thank you. Sarah or Arnab, would you like to say a couple of words about?
Thank you, Marina. And I cannot put on my camera because my camera driver has some problems with the Zoom software.
No worries, no worries.
I'm sorry about that. I'm from Kolkata in India, and my background is in English, and I'm presently completing my second master's from GCS, the Global Center for Advanced Studies, in theology, and I am a transdisciplinary studies certificate student at the new center. I've almost like completed the 2 years at the new center, and why I took this course, because I have three distinct spheres of interest, research interests. The first one being the long 19th century, and it focuses on the universal expositions and the spiritualist movement across Europe, like from the USA to Europe. So I bring these two together through speculative fiction of that period of the long 19th century, and also the ecosystem of things and which created spectacles at the universal expositions, and how the spiritualist movement was related to that through not just the exotic nature of exotic objects in the universal expositions, but also through the spiritualist usage of wondrous objects like Ouija boards and others. So this is the first half of the first part of my research, which I intend to develop a PhD project upon. And the second part is in my theological research, which focuses on ritual and the everydayness of ritual, and how ritual can be both ontological and existential. So this is the second part. And the third part at the new center is still under development. Because I recently took a course with the founder of the new center, Mohammad Salemi. I'm working on it still, and it's the triple helix of history and historiography, how nature, technology, and the social are entangled across various domains. And I found why I took this course, because I am trying to bring these three domains together through a design cosmology, some sort of I'm sorry, some sort of pan-computationalism, design cosmology and pan-computationalism, and also a kind of ritualistic political theology that that takes into account both the reincarnational philosophy, and also its reputation as ritual in a background of a more designed cosmos that specifically offers soteriological inclinations through reincarnation repetitions that ultimately forges soteriological selves that try to subvert and escape the larger cosmological design. So I'm not looking at it from a Tudor perspective of it, or anything like that, but I'm looking at it more from an interaction between the like formative selves that tends towards soteriology, and also how that self interacts with the larger universal cosmological and social systems that enacts or activates techniques of salvation through repetition and difference, and perhaps to transcend that complex universal system itself. So that's it. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you so much, Arnab. This is all fascinating, and I'd be very, very curious to know what you think after the final session, after the fourth session. We'll be talking about cosmology and and materialism as a, and even about the ritual in a sense. And another question is political significance of the ritual. That when we speak about religion as in its anthropological sense, as a connection, social connection of sorts, than any ritual could be easily and immediately seen as the primary political manifestation. But
Absolutely, Marina.
it's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm sure we will have a lot to explore together.
Exactly, Marina. Thank you. And I'm developing on these questions. So hopefully I'll be able to take away something substantial from this course. So thank you.
Thank you, Arnab. Sarah, would you like to say a couple of words about yourself?
Sure, I'll be quick. I'm a freelance classical musician based in the US, and I also have a philosophy degree. I guess I'm taking this also out of interest in the current geopolitical situation and what it means to be ideologically coherent as an American now. Also interested in the idea of ideological or of political impotence and institutional impotence. And yeah, I think that's about it.
Thank you so much. So thank you everyone. I hope we'll bring more geopolitics and reflection on arts and creativity, and the role of political culture on the one hand and culture in politics on the other. And we'll sort of use our theme of radicalism as a conceptual glue. Let's see how things work. There are just a couple of final remarks I'd like to make for the next class. We'll be meeting next Friday, same time, right? And I'd really like to hear more from you guys and to spend much more time on discussion and pinpointing the soft points of my argument or drawing on each other's line of thought in our discussion and understanding of radical subjectivity or political radicalism. So I would kindly ask you to prepare presentations the way you like it. There are no formal requirements on my side. If you want to use PowerPoint, please do. If you want just to go through, certain a set of, points, claims that form a coherent argument and illustrated with one picture easily. If you want to share scattered thoughts on the material, but which are, connected by one question, you're very welcome. I'm also very open to connect to, listen to presentations, connecting, your own work, your project, something you're working on with something you read. Next Friday, we'll be talking about What is to be Done by Lenin. I think it's a very kind of an ad hoc written text. It talks about people and whose surnames, whose names say little to most of us, and it really belongs to its time and its political conjuncture. But at the same time, I think it is possible to grasp the style of his writing, or certain ideas of what it is to be a revolutionary, or certain problems that he raises. So please read it with a very, very open mind, and try to find something that speaks to you and to what you're doing at the moment, and build on that. And for the presentations, I think ideally Ideally it should be groups, so 2 or 3 people together, make a presentation, but there are not many of us tonight, today, and I would maybe suggest you think of it a little, and then we can discuss it on Google Classroom, for example, how we will continue about it. Ideally, again, the group of 2 people make a presentation. So I encourage you to talk to each other. Maybe since there are 5 of us at the moment, one group should be 3 people together, or someone whose interest at the moment, whose reflection doesn't fit the group at all, can deliver a presentation on his or her own. Let's catch up in a couple of days on Google Classroom and discuss how we go about this. But ideally, I would really like to hear the presentations next time. Each presentation no longer than 20 minutes, please. Ideally 15. I would really prioritize discussion. So first, again, my introduction with the small lecture, then presentations, connecting material or reading with your questions, and then our discussion. And if everything is if something is unclear, please reach out. You have my email, you have my 2 emails, you can use either of them. And I see the hand here, so now we will have a commentary.
Oh, we can. I will share the sheet with the text to make the presentation. We make the spreadsheet with the text, and I will send to the students.
Fantastic. Yes, I see the spreadsheet, and thank you. I will look at it afterwards.
Okay. Fine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Anything else? Anything we haven't discussed? No? But again, reach out anytime. And I thank you for choosing the seminar and for keeping my company here. I'll leave you now to digest everything I've shared with you today, and I look forward to seeing you next Friday.
Bye. Thanks for the class. Thanks for the seminar.
Thank you.